in person, and I didn't record it. So I had two jobs in that, which was to introduce and to record, and I only did one out of two. So when they start making redundancies, we can put that on my key performance indicators. I want to thank everyone. This is very exciting. I want to thank everyone online as well. What we're going to do is I'm going to give a short introduction. Nick is going to give a presentation of his important book. And then what I thought would be nice is I'm going to just ask as a discussant 2 or 3 kind of leading questions that other people can come in on, and then open it up to everyone. Okay. I'm going to warn everyone in advance, because Nick and I have known each other now for what? Almost 10, but 5 years, 6 years?
Pre-pandemic. It's just like it's a pre and post-pandemic.
Pre-pandemic. I think you one of my favorite compliments was you said you're the only boss I ever had who says class war more than me. Which again, please put that on my CV. But I say that because I'm about to do something that I know Nick hates, and that's why I didn't share with him. I know he'll want me to say 2 words in a very brutalist sense about the book, so that he doesn't have to be embarrassed about how brilliant he is. But I refuse to do that. And I'm actually going to read something that I wrote, because
wow,
I really love the book. And I also want to say working with Nick is pretty much one of the reasons I came back to Essex, and it's one of the honors that we have. And it's why we have the group we have and the research center we have. So I'm going to read out loud. Can everyone hear me online?
I'm assuming again. Mario said the slides were coming through fine.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
Oh, excellent. Okay. There are some books that seek to persuade us that change is possible, and others that force us to see that change has already happened. Or something worse belongs to the latter category. Nicholas Beuret's new book is a bracing, uncompromising intervention in contemporary climate politics. It insists that the green transition we so often imagine as a future project is not only underway, but it's unfolding in a profoundly unequal and destructive way. The question is not whether there will be a transition, but whose transition it will be and what kind of world it will leave behind. In Beuret's hands, the green transition becomes a site of political struggle rather than a neutral process of technological adjustment. The book's subtitle, Why We Need to Disrupt the Climate Transition. You have to leave or so much you get away with that.
It was so much worse the first few times around.
It's not a provocation for its own sake. It captures the central argument that the dominant forms of decarbonization emerging across the global north, state-led industrial policy, corporate green growth, and market-driven adaptation, are steering us towards not a better world, but in fact something worse. The green transition, in his view, risks deepening the very crisis it claims to solve. At a moment when politicians speak of green growth, net zero, and building back better, Beuret asks, what is being new? Engagement with climate movements is stark. The transition, as currently organized, is a new phase of capitalist restructuring that promises to make most of us poor, more precarious, and I love this part, more exhausted, even as it opens vast new frontiers for profit, resource extraction, and surveillance. I'm just going to read a little bit more, and I hope it's all right.
Yeah.
The book begins with the claim that we are in the middle of a war of transition, but only one side is fighting. And again, I blame Jason, but one of the reasons I came to Essex, and I know a lot of us are here, is because it was one of the few places back in the day that refused to say there is a war of transitions going on and we have to learn how to fight it better. So I hope it's all right, Nick, but I do think it's in that Essex tradition. This framing sets the tone for the rest of the text. He invites to see the transition not as a single coordinated project, but a contested terrain where corporations, governments, workers, and communities are all struggling, often invisibly, over the meaning of survival. The war metaphor was not merely rhetorical. For Beuret, the green transition is inseparable from geopolitical competition, economic nationalism, and the reorganization of global supply chains. He puts the return of state industrial policy, from the Inflation Reduction Act to Britain's subsidies for green steel, as evidence for new kinds of mercantilism, which is under the banner of decarbonization, the North is reasserting control over raw materials, labor, and technology, often at the expense of global North and the internal peripheries within the global. The war of transition then is both literal and technological and structural. It encompasses resource conflicts, trade wars, and the militarization of borders, but also the quieter violence of job losses, debt, and rising prices. What makes his intervention so powerful is that he refuses both the complacency of green optimism and the cynicism of outright denial. The transition is happening. It is not a lie or a fantasy, but neither is it salvation as it's sold. This realism, neither utopian nor diffuse, allows him to focus on the real mechanisms through which transition is transforming daily life. If there is a mood that runs through this book, it is neither despair nor triumph, but exhaustion. And Beuret captures with the unusual honesty the psychic toll of living through these overlapping crises. And I think it's one that, as we deal with our students today, liberalism and exhaustion, and how class war is waged through making us more exhausted, was something that was captured wonderfully in the book. In my, maybe because I'm also just tired in general. The transition, he argues, is not energizing political action, but crushing it. Heat stress, precarity, and burnout are not incidental. They are part of the system's functioning. The climate crisis does not just destroy crops or homes, it degrades our capacity to imagine alternatives. And yet the book is not hopeless. Its title, or something worse, is a warning, but also a demand. The future will not automatically be better. It might easily be worse. But the recognition can be liberating, because it clears the ground for genuine political imagination. His realism about decline and attraction allows him to recover a different kind of one rooted not in optimism, but in solidarity, persistence, and the collective refusal to give up on one another. This is where his vision of counterplanning becomes for me most powerful. In a time when governments tell us to accept lower living standards, Beuret insists that we plan our own lives differently. Hope, in this sense, is not the belief that things will improve on their own, but the commitment to fight for a livable world, even when the odds are poor. So this book arrives at a moment of disillusionment in climate politics. After 3 decades of summits, targets, and green rhetoric, emissions continue to rise, extreme weather worsens, and inequalities deepen. The official narrative has shifted from preventing disaster to managing, from transformation to adaptation. In this context, the book cuts through the paralysis of policy debates by reframing the issue as one of power and conflict. So I know from experience that if you actually do want an extremely dry, intense, and comprehensive discussion of policy, Nick can also very much provide that.
Just that boring.
For me, its importance finally lies in 3 contributions. First, it redefines the terrain of climate politics and the field meaning therein. He shows that transition is not an abstract goal, but a concrete process that is already transforming economies, workplaces, and homes. By naming it as a war of transitions, he invites us to see climate politics not as a domain of technocrats, but as a field of struggle over everyday life. Second, it connects ecological crisis to class struggle in new ways. The concept for me of the squeeze, for instance, that is the chapter 1, exposes how climate change and its proposed solutions are experienced unevenly, deepening social divisions, and also challenges the comfortable separation between environmental and economic politics, insisting that they are one and the same. And third, for me, it offers a strategic vision that goes beyond both despair and reformism. The dual emphasis on blockade and counterplanning provides a way to link resistance to creation, disruption to reconstruction. It is an argument for building power from below in the very midst of collapse. Perhaps most of all, the book matters because it restores a sense for me of political agency and urgency. Beuret refuses the comforting fatalism that tells us that transition is inevitable or that individual action is all that remains. Instead, he asks what it would mean to take hold of the transition ourselves, to shape it according to collective needs rather than corporate interest. In doing so, he reframes climate politics as a question not of managing decline, but of fighting for dignity and survival. So I'm very, very proud to introduce this book. It's a wonderful book. I hope that everyone reads it. And I'm also very proud to introduce my colleague and comrade, Nicholas Beuret.
Fantastic introduction of what? Far more formal than I thought. I thought like I'd come off the back of me today, so I kind of expected this just to be like a 5 people and maybe a dog in a room and just like very informal. And now I feel like I have to live up to the moment.
Well, it could have been something worse than that.
It could have been what. Thanks. Right. So what I was going to do is sort of just introduce the first half of the book and leave the second half to conversation afterwards. I kind of figured if I could double down on the analysis and the depressing bit, then we could talk revolution and stuff afterwards in the second half. And that might be the way to go. Just also in true business school entrepreneurial spirit, I have half-price copies to sell. So if you haven't got one, you can get one for £6.
We bought it for full price. I thought you were a friend.
I just got them. But I do have half-price copies, so I can also sell you a half-price copy, and then maybe I should leave things out and say, yeah, no spoilers, it's in the book. All right. So it's funny because I actually I teach on international business, and I did the lecture this week on a time of environmental crisis. So I sort of tend to go topic foundations of macroeconomics, back and forth sort of stuff. So, and it was it's somewhat depressing as doing environmental stuff at not just in a business school, but at higher education more generally, as concern seems to have fallen off a cliff. Like awareness is vaguely, everyone knows what the words mean. Very few people actually understand what climate change is. When you ask people to describe it, no one can describe it. I sometimes have 1 or 2 global sustainability students in my modules, and they always know everything, which is fantastic, but nobody else does. But it's concern that seems to have fallen off a cliff every time. And it used to be like a really simple process of asking people if people were concerned. And even 5 years ago, it was half the room. Not a single person raised their hand today. There was a room of 60 students, not one put their hand up. So it's quite low. And I think, at least in part, there's a sense that, and when this book came out, there's a sense that I was a bit too late. I missed my moment to cash in on the climate crisis, because like no one cared about climate change anymore. It was kind of done. Trump was going to tear everything up. It was already all over. But I think the genesis of the book, the genesis point of the book, sort of says something about that moment. And the initial idea, like I love, Rishi's up there. There's the young people staring off into the sky. It's a future of green. I mean, they're wearing hard hats. It's like it's green industry, manufacturing, building a better future. That's the whole vibe. And on one side, you've got this is what was promised in endless documents and journalistic articles. It was like environmental campaigners. Everyone was like, what's going to happen is literally going to be this whole revival of the economy. It's not just going to be a solution to climate change. What we're going to get is green jobs and green growth, and it's going to be a positive win-win economic, ecological story. Endlessly promised. I mean, right. I'm going to have to use that mouse and not the arrows. I mean, I could have also used, I'm going to go back and forth with my notes over here. I could have used this image of the time as well. And this is a moment of, in some senses, like I want to say it's a mirror moment of the politics of the green transition, in the sense that on the one hand, you had the story of green jobs, a revival of sort of manufacturing, a sort of to undertake the transition would be to reinvest in our lives and our economy. On the other hand, there was a sort of a shadow, sort of a hinge point. On the one hand, it was decried that this was a farce, it was a series of false solutions, that the transition wasn't happening at all. And this is something you can see endlessly now in terms of, and then last year, coal usage had reached its highest point ever. Emissions are still climbing. Carbon sinks are collapsing. climate change is getting worse. There's no obvious metric by which you could say it's the transition's actually happening or underway. And I think we far more, at least in academic circles, hear about the idea of addition, not substitution. We're just adding renewables to fossil fuels. So we're not swapping them out. We're not reducing one and adding the other. At the same time, I think it's a good image because there's something in the idea that actually all you'd have to do is to tell people the actual truth of what was going on. And that was a demand in Extinction Rebellion's demand was if politicians just told people the truth, then change would necessarily follow. And why I think that's important is that the two images are actually more closely related than they seem, in the sense that a true transition, one that follows from the facts, is necessarily one that produces positive outcomes. It produces good jobs, it grows the economy while reducing emissions, it solves climate change. There's a polarization between a real transition that engages with the actual situation at hand and no transition at all. It's either a transition or it's good. And what that was the starting point for me was that, well, what if the transition is both happening and is not good? What if it's both? A transition in terms of a reorganization of like not just superficial elements of the economy, not just in terms of substitution of one form of power and another. What if it's a fundamental reorganization of the political economy of much of the industrialized world, and at the same time a transition into a much hotter future? So that's was my initial hunch, and like that's where the book came from, was to look at the transition as a period of contestation, like initially the book was going to be called A War of Transition, and there was going to be more Gramsci in it, and to try to put like, of course, with all due humility, map out an entirely third kind of war, not position maneuver, but one of transition, and what would it mean to be in a period of transition. My Verso editor, Rosie, quite rightly said, lose that half of the book and do like actually strategy and how we actually fight on a war of transition, not the theory of it. Because I made the book much better and shorter and cheaper. I'm sorry to the buyers who paid the price to it. But the book and the research came out of a desire to treat the transition as both real and not just inadequate, but possibly move away from the notion that a green transition necessarily had to be a positive process in itself. And the book starts, this is Port Talbot in Wales, is a steel mill. The book starts here, and there's a number of reasons why it starts here, and I'll come to them in a minute. But just for those who don't know the story of Port Talbot was at one point one of the largest steel producers in Europe. It is a steel mill, and like most mills, there was a series of closures between the 1970s, where the employment was at its peak, until just a few years ago. Employment had steadily ratcheted down. And the main reason it had ratcheted down, in two bursts really in the 1980s and 2000s, was due to international competition. And this is often not, when like look at union documents, the rest of it, it's often not appreciated that the UK had gone from using most of the steel it produced in the 1970s, about 2/3, to being an export-orientated economy. It only used 13% of what it produced last year. So there was a real fundamental shift in what steel was to the UK economy. We've gone from using what we produced to exporting it, so having to compete internationally. So we lost out to competition. And at the same time, as with most industry, steel to a lesser extent than car manufacturer or machinery manufacturer, steel also lost employment to automation. So most of the story of the decline of steel in the UK occurs prior to the green transition, the implementation of transition policies. It's lost to competition and automation. But I actually now think it's 2023, towards the end of 2023, the owners of Port Talbot steel mill, Tater Steel, announced that they were actually losing about £1 million a day. was a date. I'm now, because I don't have the book in front of me, I've written up the book and I've forgotten all my facts out of the book. They were losing $1 million a day, I think it was. And that they actually, they needed to talk to government, they needed a plan to do something with the mill, or they were going to have to shut it. It was no longer profitable. The government sat down with them, they came up, they worked together on a transition plan to producing green steel. Now, green steel is a relatively tried and true process. You move from using essentially coal in the production process in a blast furnace to using electric arc furnaces. So use electricity instead of coal. And essentially that could mean, depending on your grid structure, you can move from using fossil fuels to renewable energy to make steel. And steel, about a third of the world's steel is already produced like this. The plan was put together. It was agreed to, and the government announced they were going to support, they were going to pay about a third of the cost of the transition, about 500 million. The whole thing to move from blast to electric would be about 1.5 billion. It was announced, the government declared it a win. Next day, Tata Steel said we're going to sack out of the remaining workforce of 4,000 people, 2,800 of them as a part of the transition. One of the reasons the story is important to the book is because this captures something quite essential about the transition itself, the nature of the transition, the stakes of the transition, who benefits, who doesn't, and why it's arranged that way, but also some of the mis-selling of the transition that creates a particular kind of political affect that shapes then political engagement around the transition. Well, it's worth noting that I mean, just in terms of that affect, you sort of see it now with reform hovering around the factory gates. There's almost some sort of like far-right inept, like Leninist party with their leaflets trying to recruit workers, possibly more successful than most current Leninist parties in recruiting workers. And there are union complaints in Wales of members giving up their membership and taking up a Reform Party membership, saying it's worth more to them. It's more likely they'll get a positive outcome. And in part, Nigel Farage has declared that he'd reopen the blast furnaces and he'd restart production. Now, you can't actually restart the blast furnaces. It's physically impossible. And it would cost more to build the new furnaces than just install the electric arc. So but in some senses, that doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter that Farage lies or just makes up crap on the spot. He's speaking to that sense that there was something, like a promise is being betrayed. Now, I will get to like the question of betrayal as one of the main products of the transition as it's being unfolded as a real process. The basic premise of the book is that it's essential to think about or to focus on what was promised. And this is not the transition that we were sold. This is not what was talked up. It's not what unions and stood by next, on the doorstep next to politicians to talk about as a positive way forward. It's not even vaguely close to some of the Green New Deal tinged talk early on. Now, the transition constitutes a profound reordering as I argue in the book. I argue that it's built with borrowed parts. Some of those parts are neoliberal. So there are clear continuities between the neoliberal era that supposedly ended 2008 and the actual reality that much of that infrastructure, way of thinking, policy documents, policy instruments linger on. Now, it may well be that they're zombified and they don't have any other ideas in their toolbox, but clearly a significant part of the transition is organized through neoliberal principles. But there are some quite distinct differences and some very specific tools that are being rolled out and used and implemented that make this period distinct from the neoliberal one. Possibly the most important one, and this is, I don't get to it till later in the book, but is actually the overarching context, is that all of this is taking place against the backdrop of economic stagnation. That what we're dealing with is the emergence of the zero-sum global economy, and that's in part the steel story of international competition, export-oriented growth, of having to deal with there not being sufficient national or global demand for a product, and that forming the context within which the attempt to transform national economies through processes of innovation, creation of new forms of manufacturing, new kinds of employment, is already starting to come up against its limits. Like I'm definitely not going to get into the weeds on economic growth. That's a whole other thing. But it's a pretty crucial context of the story. And like in the book, I sort of get into what are the options or potentialities for restoring economics. And I kind of feel like I also did a lecture on this last week, and I kind of feel myself going back into my like second year business student module on growth, lecture on growth. And I'm definitely not going to do that because I just get blank stares from them and all portents of doom, like why am I even at university? Why haven't I just moved to a tropical island somewhere to live out the rest of my influencer days? Which definitely is a vibe that comes off in my lectures sometimes. But I mean, the first half of my international business module this year has been really depressing for the students. I'm really hoping the other lecturers can pull it out of the bag and make it far less, like, more lighthearted. But given that it's Callan and Paolo, I don't think that's going to happen. So it's going to be a very depressing module. Economic stagnation is a crucial part of the context for the narrative that I put together. Another one is the ongoing cost of living crisis. Now, I'm going to get to that at the end. There's two main contexts for the transition: economic stagnation and a continual squeeze on not just people's material lives, but their psychic and affective lives as well. All right. So, how am I doing? All right. I'll try not to go too long. This would not be a business school presentation without some McKinsey graphs on the side with it. Like that's vital to what we do. So stagnation is more than a context for the transition. It's a kind of genesis. Now, in the 90s, there was quite a lot of work, particularly sort of in NGOs and think tanks, a lot of environmental economists and the rest, and sort of new Keynesians, the emergence of new Keynesians in the UK around the New Economic Foundation, around how you'd use the challenge of climate change to address social ills and restore economic productivity and growth. Because even in the 90s as well, this conversation around declining productivity rates, declining growth rates dates back to the 90s. The dot-com boom really kind of masked, and like I said, a few years of incredibly cheap energy masked some underlying issues. But it was only really with the 2008 financial crisis that lots of the sort of the widely whispered worries around growth and productivity sort of came out to the open. As after then, that a lot of this stuff got dusted off and revitalized, and it was started to be broadly adopted. The idea being, you can take a challenge, decarbonization, and this can be a means of restoring economic growth. Overwhelmingly, the narrative would be through revitalizing manufacturing. And there's a whole series of economic reasons why you focus on manufacturing in terms of productivity growth, economic growth. The long story short is that there's not been in the past 150 years any economic success story from any nation that is not driven by manufacturing. Manufacturing is largely understood to be the driver of national economic growth, productivity, broader employment. It also has a massive multiplier in creating vast numbers of other jobs. And so manufacturing is always seen as the cornerstone here. Now, after 2008, by the time we get to Paris in 2015, the Paris COP, the Paris Accord signed, and start to see some real momentum moving on the creation net zero frameworks, a broad transition framework has come into view, and you start seeing implemented. Now, this is different from country to country because different countries have different legislative frameworks and political cultures, et cetera. But accepting China, which has a completely different state-led development program, accepting China, this is the basic framework for most countries. The idea was that the role of government, and this is where it's the linkage to neoliberalism, the role of government was not to do things themselves, but to create a particular kind of atmosphere, from tax breaks through subsidies, directly funding research. Like, for instance, the UK government funded Nissan to build electric cars, like hundreds of billions of pounds. To find ways to de-risk investment, to create whole new markets, the heat pumps for solar panels, to subsidize profits through contracts to wind farms and solar generators. The whole idea was to create a situation that would mean that private capital would invest in infrastructure, new businesses, and research and development to create innovation. And this process of encouraging investment would itself create the transition. And all that government needed to do was to set up some quite specific market and non-market conditions, and then private capital will do the rest. But in a very real sense, this framework is a framework for privatizing climate change. Now, where this differs from neoliberalism, there's a few key points. Like, it doubles down on rentierism and ensuring profitability by creating specific kinds of contract mechanisms that more or less guarantee revenue stream for businesses, which is at odds clearly with the market imperative. So there's many aspects of this that feel very, very anti-market in a sense. But the basic story, and this will be super familiar to anyone from the business school, is that private capital would be encouraged to invest in innovation, and innovation would, in true Schumpeterian mythological frameworks, then create, do creative destruction and expand business opportunities and drive productivity growth, and magical things will happen. And this is even this thing about the IEA, the International Energy Association. Yes, I never use the full name. I only ever use IEA. They, for years, they do a little innovation index, and they'd sort of tell, report back on how many technologies are yet to be invented. And even just a few years ago, we were at like 60% of technologies that we need haven't been invented yet, which in a sense is really like a scorecard for business being like, yeah, there's an opportunity. I can invent a newfangled thing and be brilliant. And then I think this year they've said 65% have been invented. There's only 35% left. So it's almost like a flash sale on innovation. What can you invent and get lots of money, and then guarantee pole position and corner the market and create a monopoly so you don't have to compete, which is what all businesses want to do at the end of the way. Now, promise to business was this McKinsey chart on the side. There was massive revenue potential in delivering on this green transition. They promised to unions, to workers, and to the more general public was that this would mitigate against the annual sort of rollout of austerity measures. It would shore up the high street. It would generate jobs. It would keep those jobs that were under threat from globalization. It would keep them in place. Your industry wouldn't flee. There'd be jobs for your children. There'd be new industries to invest in. There'd be opportunities of ours. Jobs, jobs, jobs. I think it was Biden who said, like, when they say green, I think jobs. Was it he? Well, they said he climate. I can't remember which one it was. But that's kind of the promise of the whole transition, was jobs. And not just any jobs, but manufacturing jobs.
Bless you. Bless you.
So it didn't really turn out that way. And it's not really turning out that way. And I was doing research for something else, and I came across this. I was doing some research on reform in net zero. And the number one word is a different poll, and the number one word that comes up in public polling in the UK when they ask, what word makes you think of the UK? It's decline. That's quite phenomenal. It's something similar. There was a poll today that came out today about something similar in France. It's declining. Now, this is not a new story. In some senses, the transition is quite similar to some of the other phases of globalization that resulted in deindustrialization in particular areas, and the creation of quite a vast and precarious service economy. The neoliberal part of the transition doubles down on that narrative and story. Where we were promised industry, there's actually, it's not just steel. Most manufacturing and heavy industry is under similar pressures. And it's not a different story to the 80s and the 2000s, in that when you green an industry, often you bring in new processes and equipment. More often than not, they require fewer workers, just from the nature of the process. So to make an electric car uses, you need fewer workers. And a fuel car, it has a smaller supply chain, it has fewer parts, and then it also has secondary effects where you don't need petrol stations anymore. There's like all these other industries that threat, subsidiary industries that threat in the transition. Also, when you build a new factory for new electric cars, you're going to do it at a far more capital intensive level. So that's a classic business problem. When you have a moment of disruption, you make the most of it. So you then fully automate everything, roboticize everything, you introduce all the organizational efficiencies you can that really double down on the job loss in that particular industry. The promise was jobs, and you can be more critical. The promise made by men, to men doing manly jobs, making things, was they would have jobs. There's a very gendered aspect of this, because apart from green industries, the other major growth areas for employment are in health and social care. And they're not jobs that manly men who bash things with a hammer really want to go and do. There is actually quite a gendered component to it. And I don't explore it all, but I would not be surprised if that wasn't in part some of the dynamic underlying of resurgent misogyny. I don't think it's purely just a reaction to austerity decline or even a threatening of privileged positions of men within society. I think there is probably a green element to misogynistic tide. But the promises made implicit in the deal were broken. So at least in the book, one of the overarching arguments is that the affect that dominates here, and I think we're starting to see it creep out of the workplace into communities where green development is taking place, the small businesses being squeezed by green, like things they perceive as green impositions in their margins, is a sense of betrayal. And it's a particular affect that's far more easily, at the moment, up until the elections that Zach Belansky to the Green Party leadership, mobilized by the right, and particularly the far right, far more than any other political actor. It's particular that, because we're talking about betrayed promises, none of the politicians responsible for the creation of these frameworks are believed. No one believes that either the Labour Party or the Tories in the UK will deliver on anything. There's no trust left. Nonetheless, while you have this sense of betrayal, it's also true, because we're doing both at the same time, it's also true that the net zero sector, at least in the UK, is growing at 10% a year. There are literally hundreds of thousands of people, I think last count, 660,000 people employed in the sector. By some measure, it's already, we're already talking about comparable with industries, heavier industries. It's a massive employer. The average salary is higher. I mean, 10% growth rates for an economic sector, we're talking 10 times the rest of the average rate of the economy. It's one of the few bright spots. So there has to be some way of squaring the sense that there's a betrayal when at least some of what the promise was in terms of growth and green jobs is coming true. Now, one of the ways I try to square it in the book is by looking at what actual jobs we're talking about. Now, there's a geography to this. We can talk at least at a national level, probably also a global level. There's kind of this is not a phrase I use in the book that we'll get into, but there is a kind of green combined and uneven development taking place. And that there is a punishing geography to it, where lots of the places that already suffered deindustrialization are suffering a further greening of their deindustrialization. The majority of the jobs produced through the transition are in the service sector. So all the same problems in terms of growth, multipliers, and all the rest of it apply to the transition economy. So even as a solution to growth, altering growth, it's a non-starter. There's two basic job types that dominate green industries. Now, one is waste processing. It's the majority of the waste industry is waste processing, so handling rubbish or sorting through rubbish. It's low paid, lots of immigrant labor in Europe. I think the statistic for immigrant, like sort of non-European immigrants involved in waste processing is about 25% of the workforce. Super. 10 minutes. I'm going to be done faster than that.
Oh, you're up.
So there's a, picking up other people's shit is not really the job that they promised. So in some senses, that's a non-starter. Like the people don't even really talk about waste processing as a green job. It's almost like it's always included in the statistics, but then they're kind of quiet about it. Sort of like, yeah, it's green as in figuring out waste. And this will park it over there and don't want to talk about it too much. But waste, big one. The headline one, the one that actually they kind of fudge, and sometimes they make it seem like it's a manly job doing industry stuff, is installing things, heat pumps, solar panels, could be insulation. Increasingly, significant parts of the construction industry look like installation work where you take prefab parts and put them together. Increasingly, IT is also taking prefab parts and components, including software components, putting them together. Manufacturing is also slowly moving towards an assembly, like a sort of a lower skilled assembly model, where the supply chains increasingly exist somewhere else. An installation economy with Chinese characteristics would be a way of thinking about it. What jobs have been produced are installation jobs. So we take stuff made somewhere else, largely in Chinese supply chains, where the value captured and the actual job multiplier effect is in those supply chains, and where the productivity gains are largely in those supply chains where they actually make things. We take those things and we put them in people's houses. It's a service industry, largely orchestrated through smaller, medium-sized enterprises. So again, this is the extension of neoliberalism. The transition is intensifying not just the shift towards service industries, but the fragmentation of mass workplaces towards smaller economic units, which is one of the more unappreciated trends of neoliberalism. Now, this is a really heterodox sort of sector, and at the moment there's a real supply constraint in terms of labor. But conditions and wages really differ from one part of the economy to another, and from one country to another. A heat pump installer in the UK, for instance, has to be a plumber. That may change over time with qualifications, and will also, tailorization of the actual work processes themselves. Maybe our AI overlord will walk people through things to gain the plug heat pumps in, but at the moment it's relatively well paid. That's not the case in the US. Same with solar panel installation. Yeah, it's a little bit less skilled in the UK. You don't actually need to be an electrician anymore. So its wages are coming down. In the US, significant component of the residential installations are undocumented migrant laborers with very poorly paid. There's horror stories of people like moving around the country doing installation work, living out of tents. Wages, as you'd imagine, that sector, wages are often held or stolen. Raids are organized after installation work by ICE, so ICE gets incorporated into the suppression of sort of labor demands by workers, etc., etc. Overwhelmingly, we can characterize it though as a sector where what happens is you get employed in a small to medium-sized enterprise. That enterprise, as we all know, it might be a high growth rate industry, but the actual failure rate of net zero businesses is slightly higher than the background rate for other small businesses, which is already high. Like the majority of small businesses and medium-sized enterprises fail within 5 years. So you actually have quite a dynamic sector with quite a strong degree of precarity. Conditions are not always fantastic. There's a lot of pressure to cut corners. I think there was just in the last week, there was a scandal that seemed to barely make a dent, which is lots of the house insulation contracts in the past 8 years have been so poorly done that it's like a 1.5 billion pounds worth of insulation has to be removed and put back in again. There's a process of what you consider the inshitification of the transition, like the Cory Doctorow concept. And if you go to local Facebook groups and communities, you can see like endless complaints around solar panel installations being done poorly, EV chargers not working, just constant complaints. And so there's a part of this dynamic is that not only are the jobs not what were promised, often not as well paid or as secure as you'd hope, like in a mass workplace with good union benefits. But the pressure to cut corners and to reduce costs means that you kind of get a really shit transition, even if it's not the transition you necessarily want in the first place. Now, there definitely is manufacturing, and this is a chart again, this came out a couple of weeks ago. It sort of shows China's effectively spending or investing in the equivalent of a Marshall Plan every year at the moment to build global value chains to produce the infrastructure for the green transition, all the actual machinery bits. If it's uneven at a national level and an international level, we can say that there was a war of transition, a race to dominate the manufacturing component, and it's been won. It's over, and China won. And everybody else just has to find their place within that. And this helps make sense of some of the moves, everything from BP doubling down from remaining fossil fuels to Donald Trump to the chip wars to the situation Holland finds itself in after seizing control of a semiconductor factory that was owned by China. This green neo-mercantilism has very real consequences, particularly in the zero-sum world. So this is the last, I'm going to do the last slide. I'll do my penultimate slide. Of course, like I said right at the beginning, this is not a transition. This framework is not going to arrest climate change at any reasonable level. It's notable that for quite a number of years now, with sort of the tallying up policies and programs and the rest of it, all come to more or less the same conclusion. More or less, we're on track for about 3 degrees. The only real change to that has been a noticeable acceleration of climate change, of sort of emissions, of climate change emissions, of actual rate of warming. The main difference is that when this whole framework was put together, there was a sense that if there was a radical shift, and this is not a radical shift in terms of bending that emission curve down, we'd end up with about 3 degrees of global warming by 2080. Ballpark. That's now somewhere between 2050 and 2060, according to some of the most recent estimates. So it's a shortening of our timeline and a worsening of the problem. A big chunk of the book, a big chunk of the framing of the book sort of wants to, on the one hand, take that transition economy story and sort of really sort of posit that as the context for social, economic, and political conflicts for the next 20, 30 years. But we can't also park climate change. So a lot of books on the political economy of green industries and the rest of it kind of almost just pretend that climate change is just a reason to do the industry stuff and forget that climate change itself has impacts. And it's what I said as the climate squeeze. And in some ways, it's not going to be new to anybody here. Like there's a few basic elements to what climate change does to our lives. And this is a chart from yesterday's FT. It was a great story where they basically drilled down into food pricing inflation. It was running about 6%, a little bit shy of 6%. They found that it was just 5 things that constituted 40% of that increase. They're staples. And you could do the same regression in different countries based on different kinds of staples. And different countries have different staples, but it's interesting when you start to look at all of the food quantities who have really shot up in price, from rice in some countries, olive oil to others. It's interesting that coffee and chocolate constitutes one of the bare essentials in this country, but considering we're moving into winter, that makes perfect sense. I don't know why beer is not listed in there. You can't increase the price of staples and not expect everybody to feel it. And I asked students today, when I asked them, do you think climate change is going to affect you? And no one raised their hand. I then said, I'm assuming most of you here do are shopping, everybody nodded, and I said, who's noticed groceries are more expensive now? Every single person put their hand up. I said, has it, do you feel it's really impacting your life? Every single hand stayed up. that's climate. And when they did the regression, when they were looking at the analysis, these 5 products have all gotten more expensive because of climate change. It's not energy, it's not anything else, it's not reflation, it's climate change. It bears repeating that climate change will make everything more expensive. But even if it only makes it a little bit more expensive, climate change makes coal-fired power stations less energy efficient, and so drives up the actual cost of producing coal-fired electricity. Like little things like that. Encourages like storm surges that shut down the inflow tanks to nuclear generation, knocks them out, incrementally increases the price of electricity, things like that. Even a small increase in essentials can really start to squeeze out people's bottom line, that's their income. And that's in some ways the most obvious way that it squeezes our lives. But I think the underappreciated element of the transition is actually the constant disruption. And that one of the things that climate change generates is a series of sort of a cascading series of disruptions and shutdowns. It could be as simple as not being able to get to work because public transport's not working. It could be that actually more intense, shorter periods of rainfall create more potholes, and that's put more strain, constantly dealing with disruption strain on local government budgets. So that means they have less money to fix those potholes. And maybe on your drive to work, you hit the pothole, break your axle, happens where I live all the time. You can't go to work that day. If those disruptions, even those small ones, add up, a business shuts. Maybe you're unlucky enough to your local store is in a flood zone. Businesses that get damaged or shut down by floods or fires, almost half don't ever reopen. So maybe you start to lose some of the essential social material services in your town, village, or area. Disruptions bit by bit add up. Between the two of them, increased costs and increased disruptions, you get an escalating drag on both household budgets and government budgets. That makes it less likely that you're going to start to make risky decisions, or that you're going to have to start to find ways to get by with less, or that governments are going to invest even less in the future in essential social services. In each instance, that material change doesn't just contract your well-being or your income or government expenditure, it shrinks your political horizon. So the argument in the book is that the climate squeeze is a squeeze, a negative pressure on most people's social and political imaginaries. That it's not just that you can't imagine a future that's growing and thriving and happy. It's like each year it becomes clearer and clearer that you can only expect less from your income, from your pay packet, from your government, from the services around you. And that the negative aspect of betrayal combines with the squeeze to create a shrinking political space. Now, the second half of the book is more upbeat. Maybe it can come out in questions. But I think there's really only three. There's 3 points. There's 3 points I make in the book, right? And I do not think there's a exhaustive. But I think, and it's in some ways, I do think that Zach Belansky's approach has been refreshing to see someone go on the offense. And actually, it's quite clear that there's no defensive struggle that will make the transition better. It actually requires vision, planning, putting forward an alternative argument. Now, that's my third point. Is I think that's something we need to do if we want to challenge, when I confront work, is to really find a scale, like a train where we can start to institute a counter planning to create a different transition, one that serves our needs. Where I landed is sort of looking at some of the lessons from radical municipalism, Red Preston, sort of local action around anchor institutions, bearing in mind that some of the last remaining mass workplaces we have are in the health, education, and public sectors. And these are fixed in place, mass employers, and are amenable to political engagement. And our argument is that politicizing our union movements and social movements and thinking about ways that we can take hold of local governance in all of its facets, maybe taking a lesson from the right in the US, which did exactly the same thing. They tried, before flooding the zone with misinformation, they tried to fill every single political space that it could, from school boards to taking out sheriff's office through local government. It tried to fill every single available political space. And that is sort of a key trend on which we can enact a more positive agenda. I think there's no way that we can start to create space for people to do this without controlling prices. And again, this is something I wrote in the book and then actually started to get real world applications. So I kind of feel like my thunder's been stolen. I'm not going to announce something that people haven't already thought of, but controlling the prices. That's impact. I should put it in there. Controlling the prices that regular consumers pay for things is absolutely essential. And there's a huge history of price controls from below. So it's not something that needs to await some sort of your party getting it together and seizing the reins of governance. It's actually something that can be organized from below particularly effective. I think renters unions are one example. Don't pay just a few years ago. Contesting energy bills is another. It's like you don't want to raise E.P. Thompson's ghost too many times, but the moral economy of the English crowd comes to mind, where prices were set in markets on the centrals from below. I think the final one, the one I list first, is that there's a need for a return to a confrontational environment. And it's difficult to say at a time of severe repression of environmental activists. And I do not think it's just nostalgia for my time in the blockading movement in Australia, but there is the environment movement is actually one of the most successful movements of the last 50 years. It has an incredible track record of success. And part of that success uses the same tools that unions use to enact change. It's disruption. If you can disrupt something, you can shape something. And the power to disrupt, and here I don't mean civic disruption, I mean disruption at the point of fossil fuel production and utilization on a mass scale, is a necessary component. It may well be that it ends up being more symbolic than practical. There are only, I think, 5 remaining refineries in the UK, so it's not technically impossible. And I'm not sure it was pre-pandemic, but there was a protest by farmers and truck drivers blockading refineries not too long ago in the UK that brought the UK within 3 days of running out of fuel. So it's not practically impossible. But I think there's at least a need to have a debate around what would it look like to block fossil fuel use and production. I'm not going to spend too much more time. I'm going to end it there, but that's essentially where the book ends up. I also don't think that's the entirety of the story. That is not the only way to fight the war of transition. And hopefully there'll be more than a few experiments in contesting the transition before it actually does become something worse. Thank you.
So I'd like to open up the questions now, and I'd like to maybe, and I don't want you to answer these one by one. I sent you some questions, but I thought there's maybe a couple broader ones we can start that can, if you'd like to bring in, then bring in other people. And I guess, I think I had 2 main things that I thought would be interesting, and there are some people actually here I know whose research might also touch on this, so it'd be exciting to hear their views. The first is that, as 2 people who've been in different ways involved in, this kind of climate movement for, gosh, how old are we now?
I'm really old.
Yeah. We're gonna say decades, and to leave it at that. It's really interesting about the way in which you start the book about the kitchen table problem and having less food, because whenever we would come up, and this is where I think you maybe, Jason, would be interesting, because if you think about it as a type of fantasy, we could have a different fantasy around degrowth and post-growth. The first thing that's always said is, yeah, but people don't want less things. Yeah, it's been so interesting to me, and I wonder if you could talk about this in terms of the green transition, how quickly they accept the same set of actually having less things through fantasies of austerity, right? So it's like we would try to give a very positive, increasingly policy-based thing of like, this is what post-growth policy could look like. This is what degrowth could look like. And it would seem that this would almost completely all fall on the level of like, you could only have green growth. And yet, I think we see this, and I think it touches on these things about why do you think that that is something in which the public has so clearly not become subjects of desire to, right? But to this idea of like, we could have a economy of abundance based on degrowth, and yet they're so easily scripted or allowing for a type of inevitability to a kind of ways in which will actually through austerity, you literally have less food on your table. So I think that would be the first thing, because I think unpicking that, which sounds very banal maybe, would be very important. I think the second thing is that I wonder if we could talk a little bit about some of the different things. So I mean, I'm very proud that we have Jordan here who's in our group and has worked incredibly well on food consumption and waste, and actually, at both I think a community level like this, but also technologically bringing networks. And not to put him on the spot, I'm sorry, but like it's like there's this kind of green transition economy you speak of, but it's like there's also this kind of parallel where there's a lot of amazing things actually happening too that don't seem to be in the green transition, or it's co-opted in a green transition, but in a way that it's like it's still happening, right? And it kind of challenges this, but it never seems to actually challenge it in an upscaled way that the kind of installation economy that you've spoken about is, right? And I'm wondering what that relation is, and if there's why that seems sometimes to be the case, that actually, like when you scratch the surface to this, like in a lot of kind of transitions, or as you said, there's a lot of amazing things happening, right? I mean, right now, you don't have to go far to actually see that, actually there's incredible new apps that let you know if restaurants have not used their food, and you can go pick it up. And actually, if you look at its success rate, it's incredibly successful. And yet that seems to be something that is kind of allowable, but with all due respect, like more on the margins, even though that's been shown to be something that's really effective and really something that can be used. So I'm kind of also wondering about like, are there ways that we can connect up? And I don't want to sound reformist, quite the opposite, so I apologize. But is there also things that I didn't see this in the book as much? I mean, it's a brilliant book, we can have everything. Also coordinating parts of the green, quote unquote, green transition that actually can be, I don't want to say repurposed because they're already doing a lot of this, but actually can kind of serve as actually existing models for the types of changes that we're talking about. So I guess those were kind of my two things, and now I want to also open it up for different questions and things they may have. Did you want to maybe answer those first, or do you want me to open?
Sure, yeah.
Well,
Very obviously very small questions.
and I'm sorry for highlighting, but it's just because we have them in the audience, so I thought it was really kind of interesting.
I think they're linked questions in the sense that so the book is not I am I'm adherent to sort of necessity to articulate a positive post-growth or degrowth vision. But I think you're right. Like it's I remember seeing a clip not too long ago that was your choice actually in a zero-sum world was either voluntary or involuntary degrowth. It's like degrowth in many ways is already happening, and you're completely right. Like I think my favorite example is like when I what's the I don't know, I don't do the consumer marketing side of things, but when they keep the same packaging but then just make things lighter.
Shrinkflation.
It's shrinkflation. Yeah. So that's one of my favorite examples. Like it's quite literally, I remember going, I don't buy chocolate. I was looking at it thinking that looks funny. And then I looked at a little number beside it was like 400 grams instead of 500 grams. I'm like, when do they start doing things in units of 400 grams? It's like it's always 500. And you start, when you see that, you start noticing that it actually is happening all over the place. And there's tiny little erosions, tiny little extra charges, all sorts of stuff like that. And I think we are in a very like cannibalistic or catabolic phase of capitalism where people are trying to squeeze ever more profits out of like ever less, ever shrinking revenue streams, or at least more and more increasingly stagnant revenue streams. And so I think the story around degrowth is like, I think there's a real sense, and this was something George Monbiot used to say back in the days of climate camp, was that people want their stuff. They want their monster trucks and their flights, and they won't want less. Whereas I think there are interesting signs around what kind of less people are prepared to put up with. And I think, and Gores was in some sense right, we're like the dominant class of people who engage in service work is a non-class of non-workers whose main relationship to work is that to say fuck that and I don't want to work, like to minimize work, to reduce it as much as possible. I think you can even read some of the drive towards self-employment.
Yeah.
like as a desire for autonomy, not just in work, but from work as much as possible, to be your own boss and no one's your boss. Your ideal dream is to go to Bali and just work from your laptop in a hammock with a smoothie. Like that's like I think there's degrowing work for all but a few people is like absolute priority.
Mhm.
So I think there's like there are elements that are people would be happy to engage in. I think how you then turn that into a program is an interesting conundrum. And again, the problem there is there are actually a huge there's like shelves and shelves of blueprints and plans for this. But I think a more profound challenge is then how do you convince people to do it? And I think there's a story in the book that comes from another book that like I was really formative for me, which is called uh Red Unions, Green Bans, by a woman called Verity Bergman. And it looks at the Builders Labourers Federation in New South Wales, like the construction workers in New South Wales and Australia. And I mean, the story, like the headline story, the feel good story is that these, really rough labourers would, a university would kick a gay student out and they'd be right, that's it, we're never building anything ever again unless you take him back in. And they'd force the university to re-enroll him. And they'd work with grannies who were worried about their park being smashed, like, right, that's it, ban. No one's ever working ever again if anyone touches the park. And they'd win. They got win after win after win after win. And lots of the heritage laws, the environmental regulations, and the anti-discrimination policies of major institutions all come back to this bunch of really rough workers in industry. And that's the feel-good story of how a union can implement change. But the actual, I think, why it's important to the question of the transition to degrowth, there was preceding these bans was 10 years of militant organizational work by Maoists who took over the union branch and engaged in a hardcore program of political education. And that's really, and I think this is why it comes back to the question of having a vision, having a plan, having a politics, is that they were able to mobilize people because they did good workplace organizing, got small wins. But without the political education, without 10 years of convincing that, these really hard, like proper rough workers that like gay rights are essential, that like feminist principles were right, that we should protect environmental spaces, without 10 years of political education, there wouldn't have been any of the bans. And I think there's a need, I think at least part of the framework of this book, but I think around degrowth, around some of these questions, is there's a need to politicize everything. And actually, I think there's an appetite for that. And like without politicization, you end up in these defensive struggles. And the defensive struggles are, how do I protect the last remaining jobs in the steel mill? How do I protect this? How do I fight this little corner? And it seeds grounds to a really reactionary set of politics.
And I think one thing that maybe is worth following up on later, but is that there's an alternative dynamic I would see there, man, in which actually the green movement in the 1990s inadvertently provided the political education for austerity. Because I really do feel this, that it presented a very deep discourse of, hey, we're going to have to do more with less, guys. And not in a neoliberal way. Like, there's a finite amount of things on the planet, and we're going to have to, have a less consumeristic life and things like this. And while I don't think that fully gripped people in the kind of effective way of like, okay, this is going to be a mass politics, so I think it had that thing. I do think that there was a kind of seeding of this, like, oh, this is a politics that we can mobilize. And so you even see it now in this thing. It's like, they're not going to give us financial information or anything unless we fight for it. But it's like, we have to do more with less, right? And there's a kind of, duessence about this as well. Like, even if it's unconscious, like, well, we're making the necessary sacrifices. So I think exactly as you said, like, this, one of the things I like is that this transition has been happening in a lot of different ways. And I think that it's all connected. And I know it sounds weird, but I do think actually, they mobilized the fantasy of sustainability in the 1990s as a type of fantasy for austerity now. Right. I mean, that was seeded, I think, very clearly, like, we're gonna have to by force do more with less, and you're just gonna have to accept it. So I think you're right. Like, I mean, I like that the vision plan. I do think, and I don't know, like, things is that this is a really interesting thing about, like, when we think about vision plan of politics, you know, and it is interesting. She talked a lot about like the industrial things, but like a lot of the book is actually about taking a more community approach. And interestingly, like you and I are both not communitarians. And quite, I think we're both on the record and published against this movement. But it was this interesting, and I think if you could talk a little bit more about that, and maybe go back to that question again. I think it's great that Jordan's here because he's done a lot. We'll work on this and everything. But like, how does the community become the new terrain for organizing in a way, right? And I think that was something that really comes through in your book. But you also seem to have a very sophisticated understanding of community that is slightly different than I think traditional peoples would think of either as just a civic space or a geographic space that people are going. It seemed to me that there was something that you wanted to really express with this movement from workplace organizing to community.
This question.
Go ahead, please.
No. You were first.
Yeah, I'm just kind of interested in all the things you've been talking about, Peter, and obviously the kind of arc of what you covered in the book, and the fact that, like, in the last 8 months as an American, I'm watching what's going on in my country, and there's like such a massive pushback that you can't even use the word environment or sustainability and still get government funding for research or government contracts and that's a movement that's kind of really threatening to come here quickly. Do you know this like march that Tommy Robinson organized in London with 100,000 people who came? They had like Elon up on the screen being, videoed in. And a lot of that, what's going on in the US is kind of coming here very quickly. So we're facing a wave that's also being kind of financed by these big tech CEOs, that kind of the next big creative disruption is going to be the impact of AI. And what I've read about what impact the server farms alone are going to have on water, energy, carbon is like massive. So I think it's not just kind of what can we do and how can we position ourselves in terms of this war of position against the false economies of the current green transition, but what about this like complete anti-transition wave that's threatening to be here like really quickly, and how that's kind of dovetailing with this moment we are potentially at with the economy, with like a new kind of industrial AI tech revolution, which is really threatening in terms of climate change. I know you must be thinking about that a lot. Like every day you read the news. I'm just really curious. It's really important to me that we hear a little bit today.
Should I take the questions around?
Yeah.
We have two. So I think we have one in the middle, one there, and one there. Is that all right?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. This is really, really interesting.
Sorry, I should have said this right. Should we maybe introduce ourselves so that everyone knows who we are in the community? I know that sounds wrong.
This is Alice. She's a philosophy department.
Hi, Alice.
And I was wondering about the war that you said China's won on manufacturing kind of new greener technology, and I was wondering whether you think that is a war that might not be over completely. It seems to me to be quite precarious as we move into a world that is more disrupted, where supply chains might more break down because of one might have pandemics, more extreme weather for various reasons. Fuel might be too expensive. So it seems very precarious to rely on this very globalized production line. But then I also wondered whether you think if that is something. So one question is why. Well, have Western governments just given up on that war? And if they haven't, or if it opens up again, do you think there's something that they should be fighting for? Or do you think the kind of tech optimism is the wrong avenue to go down? That makes sense.
Yeah, no, completely.
Let's capture these two. So in the back, and then.
So I wanted to.
What's your name, brother?
Oh, I'm James. I'm a sustainable transitions PhD student.
Oh, amazing.
I wanted to ask whether you think perhaps betrayal might be the wrong word for the experience that people are dealing with regards to job loss, because I would argue that we were sold this transition for quite some time. And I mean, if you look at the early documents on the economics of climate change, think of like the Stern, like it was acknowledged that there are going to be serious transition costs and serious job losses and serious assets that we have that are no longer valuable in the new green economy, that that we're going to have to dispose of somehow. And I think part of what you were talking about with regards to like the deal that we were sold, that maybe this deal is the root of the betrayal, is that this deal was offering reskilling and retraining to those people who are going to have their jobs lost. And maybe that aspect of the deal is where the betrayal comes in, because while we understand that job losses are part and parcel with the transition, because we have industries that we can no longer sustain with clean energy and with the transition to green transport and that sort of thing, we are going to have job losses. And I think this also touches in with the idea of the transition that's going to take place but has not yet taken place with regards to AI. Because I think a lot of people are saying, we're going to have massive job losses with AI. But also, right now, there's so much hype about AI that we don't think about the job losses. But I think in 5 to 10 years, we're going to start to realize those job losses as we're realizing the squeeze with climate change now. And so we're probably going to be less enchanted with AI in 5 or 10 years, because we're going to see the people and the assets that it's replacing in the economy. And we're going to see an increase in the amount of waste that comes from this creative destruction. So I wonder if you think betrayal is the wrong word for, well, I mean, I don't want to criticize the book, and I haven't read it, but I will. But I wonder if you think betrayal is the wrong word, because since the outset of the scholarship in the green transition, people have realized that yes, if we go through with this new deal, like jobs are going to be lost. We're going to need to, like, we've understood that since the get go. So.
And Malte?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Malte. I work here in the business school as lecturer in management. So my question is whether, as part of your research, you might have come across some potentials for making it fun for people to join the fight against climate change. So I'm asking this because I recently read an interesting interview with Nick Larles, the founder of Hope, Not Hate, who said that he kind of has to acknowledge that the right has been so much more successful at kind of taking young people seriously and kind of seeing, I think, what we see in our students all the time. They're like scared, they're squeezed, they're pressured, they have such a hard time. And kind of being part, especially for young men, of the far right is kind of, they give you a break. They like allow you to make sort of tasteless jokes, and you don't have all these demands on you regarding what you should say, how you should behave, and so on. So they've managed to kind of give young people a break, and that kind of makes it attractive, at least says this Hope Not Hate founder, and that the left hasn't been able to do that. And I think lots of people have this association in their mind with the fight against climate change is something that puts even more demands on you, and it fails to make it fun. And so maybe there's ideas there.
Excellent. Do you want to, is there,
No,
we'll take this set and then, no, but we'll make sure to get to you before. Okay.
So slightly side. But I wondered if you looked at the Scottish Just Transition Committee at all, and the work they've been doing, because that was specifically set up to try to address this issue of reskilling and redeployment. I mean, I haven't kept up with it, but I've looked at it to be honest.
Yeah.
So I mean, that addressing, and that seems to me, I
In
mean,
terms of
the Conservatives just had no idea anyway.
No.
So they were completely clueless, A, about the science, and B, about any policies. So, we haven't had proper public education in England, whereas there has been more in Scotland through mechanisms like that.
It's worth noting on that. Sorry, what was your name?
I'm Jane Hinkley,
So Jane,
interdisciplinary studies.
excellent. And thanks for all the amazing work you do here at the university. But it's important because it is something just to the biggest now demand of the independence movement in Scotland is we want energy independence because we're sick of giving our energy to England and not getting anything back. And it's really interesting that this might actually be the first, I mean, am I going to be provocative here? The first national liberation movement that is explicitly on just transitions in energy.
All right.
Three words.
In
answer.
3 words.
Yeah.
But no, I think I can try and read my way through everything except for the fun one I'm going to get to, because I think definitely I have an answer to that. So I think in terms of the AI, but I don't think this is, I don't think the sort of geopolitics or geoeconomics of this and the question of AI are distinct. And I think one of the reasons I spend so much time leaning on talking about growth is that like that really is the central conundrum. In a sense, like it's a weird situation where every single article now is basically describing AI as a bubble, and everyone knows it can't last, and that there's actually there currently is no business plan. And that's the staggering thing when you like they openly talk about there's no business plan here. There's actually no way to, for the most part, outside of very specific industrial applications, which are racing ahead in China, but not anywhere else. There's no way to make money out of it. And that's the amazing thing. Maybe you can start to generate some content, but you can only generate the content if you have other content to base it on. And it's still an open question on whether or not like that will get banned, people will fight back. At what point does it run out? What point does feeding it on itself start to mean it doesn't function anymore? Okay, there's this at the moment the main use in business use is already declining in services. The main use is as a personal assistant, and if you ask people, that's what everybody uses it now as a personal assistant, which is incidentally cratering advertising revenue and media company revenue. Both advertising companies and major media providers are just losing market share across the board. Like I think search engines, the replacement of an AI agent as sort of a search engine is decreased ad engagement by 60%. So it's only going to be useful for either doing things that people aren't prepared to pay for or advertising. And they're already trying to create closed loops, like OpenAI is creating a browser that will do your shopping for you because you have to let it have control over the browser controls. So you can just tell it what you want and there'll be no advertising involved. It'll just be a closed platform loop. And so I think I think the smart money is that it's going to break, the wave is going to break at some point, and we'll be left with this huge legacy of resources and material. But it's not fundamentally different in terms of its economics outside of China largely, except to the platform economy, which is again built on sort of rents and capturing attention. I do think, if anything, AI is going to make the problem in terms of the conflict around manufacturing share worse. Because the only place that's really rapidly adopting AI for manufacturing is China, which also has the highest rate of roboticization in the world, the highest use of running dark factories, and there's an entire other program there. They're not just doing it for efficiency. Like in part, at least some of the roboticization that's taking place in China is to deal with demographic problems. Like they can't employ, there's not enough young people who want to work in factories. And so I think one of the reasons why I think the AI is a real problem, and I think there is a block finding as much of the transition as possible. But I think even in the States, like the general direction of travel is it's slowed it down. You can't entirely stop it. Which is, and then who knows, the political fortunes will flip back around again. And
Transition then.
it's just slowed it down, hasn't reversed it at all. But I think at least as much of, I mean, if the US had a lead in green industry, then they'd be on liquid. I mean, a lot of the slowdown, a lot of Trump's reaction is because they're fighting a manufacturing share war. And part of the book is, it says at the beginning that it's really difficult to take a picture of a moving, sort of like a really fluid situation. So at the best, this is like a snapshot, and maybe in a year's time, it's completely out of date. I do think we're at the point, we've kind of passed a tipping point in terms of build out. I think that report in terms of like the Chinese supply chain, in a sense, is quite different to the previous rounds of supply chains in terms of when you have global value chains of production, like they're often centered on US corporations for the most part. Like there was decades and decades and decades of building the infrastructure to make that supply chain work. And so, China's undertaking a very similar process. But the nickel refining in Indonesia or the EV factory in Morocco, like all of these things, like once you start to build these technical, socio-technical, cultural legacy, you lock in a particular program, I think. And I think I think Europe is in an interesting position. I think there are definitely industries there are definitely ways of not just taking an Atlanticist political position and sacrificing what we have in Europe to stay on Daddy Trump's good side. And I think there are sensible paths forward for sensible European politicians who could do sensible things. But that would kind of mean making peace of being largely part of Chinese dominated global value chains. I also think it's an open question. It could all go to shit. It could all completely go to shit. But I do think that question, like they're similar questions. I think they're kind of wild cards. And again, like maybe Barrage comes out here, Le Pen in France. Maybe we have maybe you can just get fascism, and it's all really really terrible. But even with fascism, and this is one of the funny things with reform, lots of the reform councils have started to realize just how dependent they are on green funding and green jobs. And there was a running article about reform for the New Socialist, and one of the things they came across was that one of the main recipients of green funds at a local level are small businesses, and that they actually really rely on the thousands that come in through green funds, and a full quarter of their applications are fraudulent. So small businesses like Farage supporters, and not only are they big beneficiaries from green funds, that actually don't want too much scrutiny because they're actually just defrauding the system to get green funds. So it's kind of like crap at the same time, but then you can also see why the right might not necessarily want to interfere too much. In terms of the sense of betrayal and the de-skilling in the situation in Scotland, and I know in Scotland in particular, a lot of the oil workers, there was a report that Platform did that came out looking at that process, sort of saying that they were because of government austerity, they were being forced to pay for their own retraining. They didn't have the money to pay for their own retraining, so they couldn't retrain. And you're right, that is part of the sense of betrayal, that there were these things that were supposed to happen as a part of it. I do think that we can't overemphasize that people knew that there were going to be job losses. That was talked up. Stern report, lots of headline figures, but I think it's like students and climate change in the sense that people don't think it's going to necessarily happen to them. So when it does happen to them, then it's a betrayal. Like you can see the headline statistics. You could be in a relationship, say, "Oh, so many people are cheated on, or so many people are betrayed by their partner," but it doesn't necessarily mean you experience that sense of betrayal until it's encountered in your own life. And I think, you can extend the sense of betrayal. Like when you go to the supermarket and they put anti-shoplifting tags on a block of cheese. Like there's a social contract there that that's not supposed to be it's not supposed to be the case that you have to go and get a bit of cheese de-tagged so you can make a cheese toasty. That's kind of insane. I think betrayal is the right word, but I think it's the right word because it lets people dwell in a state. It's not necessarily resentment, which is quite often the far right affect. I think it's a particular kind of wound or wounding that then lets people easily displace the supposed solution to the problem into being the problem itself. So I think it's one of those things that people treat net zero policies and levies and programs as causing their problems, where actually increasing bills, war in Ukraine, climate change disruption, these things, people will try to say that to them. It's like, you're not poor because of net zero, you're poor because of climate change, but there's a displacement that takes place with that betrayal. And I think it's quite easy to mobilize. And I don't talk about it in the book, but lots of my previous research was on climate migration. I think one of the dangerous shifts that I think we could start to see, and there's fragments of it occurring, is that, particularly the language that people use around migration, is that people start to see people displaced by climate change as the cause of their problems rather than consequence of some of the economic arrangements that they find themselves in. I think betrayal is, I could be completely correct, but I do think betrayal captures something of that affective dynamic. But I think that a left populist program often operates in a very similar affective dimension as a right-wing populist. We just haven't seen very many effective left-wing populist programs. Just in terms of making environment movement fun, I think part of the reason
I think you're fun. just want to say.
Part of the reason I think the Tommy Robbins and the rest of it's fun, and I think you have to be really honest about this, is like there's two things. One is there's a diffusion of responsibility. So you can arrive and you don't have to take responsibility, which is the opposite of the political ideology of most of the environment. It's like you're supposed to take responsibility for yourself. So I think that's a problem for any sort of environment movement in terms of not taking responsibility. I think the second one, if we're going to be really honest, is it's fun to do violence. If you're a young man, it's fun to do violence. Blockading things is an incredible thrill. I can actually absolutely tell you as someone who's blockaded a ton of stuff. Like, I still remember like fighting off a horse charge when we were blockading a uranium mining office in Australia. And I was like, I was high for a month afterwards. It was absolutely incredible. Like, confrontation isn't necessarily something to be scared of. And I think particularly for young men, but not only because the environment movement in Australia is like majority women. And like every blockade I've ever been on has been as many, if not more, women than men who go hard, and it's not just because they're Australian. I think actually confrontation is fun. Costas is laughing because Costas loves his confrontation. But I think there's sometimes we like there's a fearfulness to sort of say, actually, no, we should confront this. We should be aggressive. We should go a bit harder. And I think like I could be wrong. I think there's mileage to be made in terms of building a movement that's confident to confront people. I think like my favorite image of the last few weeks is like all the t-shirts with the inflatable frog costume guy confronting immigration agents in the States, and they've just turned it into Rage Against the Machine memes and these t-shirts and like there's like guys doing kung fu with it. It's like the idea that you can confront essentially a Gestapo force abducting people and it be something that people would be like, that's super fun. Let's go to the streets and fight the fash. Right? I think like there is an affective dimension to that is pretty fun. I don't think it has to be light-hearted fun. I don't think the environment movement could do light-hearted fun with violence.
They could do green hardcore.
Costume. That's the thing. The frog costume
Yeah.
was cute. Like, and now it's everywhere. And it was in London last week for the No Kings demonstration.
I love the fact
Right,
that it's
one, like, I want to be a frog.
I love the fact that it's the inverse of Pepe the Frog as well, from like 10 years ago, the fascists from 10 years ago. It's like the inverse of the far right frog me.
I do think there's one thing though to pick up on the China thing that's worth, either talking about now or to continue your conversation is that there's the community and there's this kind of thing, but there's also like a higher level politics going on. And I think you did hit on it. I mean, with China, it's a really big difference between the West, in which it's involved in oligarchic policy, and China, which is involved in imperial strategy. And what I mean with that is that their green supply chain is part of now 15-year imperial strategy in which every part of the economy and politics is connected up in terms of a rust and belt thing to challenge what was then US and EU agenda. And they have this in position papers. Like this was like their actual thing. Like we are going to first take over East Africa. We're then going to take over Latin America. We're going to offer better conditions. We're going to build infrastructure. What's also really interesting here is that China is able to do this because its different historic blocks are better connected. So its weapons making industry and its environmental industry and its surveillance industry are all in lockstep. Where in the US, what you have is, and this is an important thing, it's not really strategically thing. So on the one hand, you have the more militaristic side, which is the Democrats, to be honest. So all the Department of Defense money pretty much goes to the Democrats. And this starts with Hillary Clinton. And what she said is like, when she was Secretary of State, this is a big thing. She said, y'all, you're going to buy our weapons or we're going to attack you. You're not going to get any infrastructure money for us. And that's it. And that's how China was first able to come in. But now it's a very interesting thing in that sense that the US is kind of has the largest military, but there's a big thing because the surveillance and the tech is starting to go towards Trump, but the military is still going towards the Democrats. But it's a really interesting thing that it's very, and I think you see this in Brazil now because that good things is that China came in with a very, very clear package. We'll take over your private security. We're going to build infrastructure. The Amazon is ours. Where the US came in and said pretty much like, do what we say or nothing. And then kind of like Trump is like, well, we'll give you a bit of money. And so it's a very kind of like corporate based oligarchic thing. And I think this is what you're speaking about is that there is a green transition going on right now. It's just as you can put it, it's not coming from the quote unquote West, right? The West is very much like short-term profits or use our military to intimidate people. And you're either gonna, I mean, the Biden and Trump thing is so interesting because they're doing the same policy, you all. They're just using different discourse. It's the exact same policy. And if you want to talk about like tariffs, for instance, the first green quote unquote tariffs was Biden on China. And you can't make the GPU chips, right? So these kinds of things, I think it is interesting talking about this and bringing this into the larger macro, because when we do talk about this, we do need to talk about this geopolitical things, because right now we have for the first time in probably 100 years where we have two geopolitical powers. One is acting on oligarchy, which is short-term profit, elite interests. We have two political parties that pretty much represent the same thing, but they are very partisan and say different things. And then you have China, which, I mean, I have to say, they're not oligarchic. They're imperial. They have a plan, and they're putting that plan forward every single day, more strategically. So,
I think on that note,
yeah,
you have to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for coming out.
Nick.
If you want, I didn't do my pitch with discount books. If you want one, come and let me know. I'll get a bunch.
Can I make a little announcement as well? Is that okay? So I'm one of the co-leaders for the Center for Environment and Society, which is a interdisciplinary research center here at the university. And we're setting up a lunch seminar. So trying to get us to enable us to do more of what we're really here for, to have these discussions. So we have 3 seminars coming up. The people and the titles might change, but the dates are set. So it's every other Monday from the 10th of November till the end of term. And it would be lovely to see you there. So if you want, just bring your lunch, and there's a short presentation and then a discussion. And yeah, I hope you can make it. Yeah, there's only a few, but
I guess I'll take a photo of it.
Oh yeah.
You want to take a photo, or you? Yeah, I'll take it.
You see that?
Let me know. Let me know.
It's
Yeah, one of the.
Yeah.
That would be
Right.